If you've clicked through for my LinkedIn article, the first part of this episode will be a bit of a recap to set the stage. If you're listening to this episode as a regular follower of my show, you can find a companion article on this topic, along with many other articles I've written over the years, on my LinkedIn profile. If you don't want my opinion, Episode 13, National Coming Out Day 2024, Up in Smoke, by Carl Marking. As the title of this episode implies, this is not going to be an uplifting story of how far the LGBTQ community has come in securing our two recently acquired rights, but rather how fragile they have suddenly become. It's not going to be a victory lap. Rather, it's a warning and a call to action. I think the spirit of National Coming Out Day 2024 must be about coming out to register to vote, coming out to save American democracy, and coming out to vote. When I first heard of Project 2025, I thought it was nonsense. I thought it was perhaps the left's first full-blown conspiracy theory. But I was wrong. It offers detailed guidance for the next conservative president to subvert American democracy as we currently know it. I spent several days reading through it, and it reads like a fearful, angry, crazy grudge match, hiding behind a wall of Christian righteousness, faux patriotism, homophobia, isolationism, and misogyny. I'm going to talk a bit about the things that really stood out to me, and invite that you find Project 2025 online and review it. You can find some good analysis pieces which may be helpful because it is written to be intentionally confusing and misleading. I found the site defeatproject2025.org, all one string with no punctuation, breaks it down section by section into easily consumable summaries. At its core, Project 2025 is this year's playbook of policies and proposals offered to ultra-conservative presidents and presidential candidates since the 1970s from the ultra-conservative think tank known as the Heritage Foundation. As such, Trump is not the first president or potential president with whom they have colluded to have their vision for America implemented. The first president to truly embrace the ideals and recommendations of the Heritage Foundation was Ronald Reagan. Reagan was so enamored with their ideas that he gave each member of his cabinet a copy of their stated goals. When he took office, the foundation had authored 2,000 proposals to advance their agenda, and Reagan implemented or initiated roughly 1,200 of them by the end of his first year in office. He referred to the foundation as a, quote, vital force, end quote, during his presidency. I was in high school and already knew I was gay when Reagan took office. And learning about the Heritage Foundation's involvement in his presidency explained a lot for me. He took office during the height of the AIDS epidemic in America, and I never understood his lack of compassion or plan for AIDS. Learning about his heavy reliance on the Heritage Foundation gave me a new understanding of why ultra-conservatives at the time framed AIDS as a punishment from God. AIDS was initially framed as some kind of inherent, self-generating disease as a result of being gay. If you were gay, then you were going to die from AIDS. That message was etched on the souls of a generation of gay men, largely because of the lack of messaging from Reagan's White House, the scientific community, and the press. Reagan's reliance on the Heritage Foundation's approach explained for me why, although sworn into office for his first term in January of 1980, he didn't acknowledge or say the word AIDS publicly until 1985, almost a full year into his second term. By this point, AIDS had become a global pandemic. While researching this episode, I learned that Rock Hudson and the Reagans were friends. Ron and Rock had both been actors, and they'd formed a friendship. In July of 1985, Rock Hudson's publicist telegrammed the White House asking the Reagans for help getting Mr. Hudson into the world's only hospital that seemed able to do something for AIDS patients. The Reagans did nothing, infamously saying it was a homosexual's disease, and therefore not their problem, and that it wouldn't be fair to help out a friend while others were suffering. A reasonable person may say, okay, then don't just do it for your friend, help everyone. But that's not how that played out. That September, Reagan was asked directly by a reporter about AIDS, and it was the first time Reagan publicly said the word. Hudson died that October from complications due to AIDS. The only good thing to come of Hudson's death was to put a household name and a face to the disease, humanizing it, and his death began a much-needed national conversation about AIDS. By the end of Reagan's presidency, more than 40,000 American men, women, and children had died of complications due to AIDS. Putting this in the context of my personal history, including what I witnessed during Trump's first presidency, including what I'm witnessing from his second presidential campaign, and having read the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, the Foundation and Trump's positions have always been this: if you don't like the reality you're faced with, ignore it, lie about it, deflect to some other bombastic issue, or as J.D. Vance has proven so willing to do, just make something up. Those are the core values of the Heritage Foundation: lie, cheat, subvert, denigrate, blame someone or something else, never apologize, and destroy that which you simultaneously claim to value, cherish, and support, all the while doing it in the name of Christianity, virtue, and freedom. I've never read a manifesto, I've never read Mein Kampf, but I know what it was within the context of Nazi Germany. I've read enough of Project 2025 to understand why it is so often called Trump's Mein Kampf. It is the de facto blueprint for MAGA Republicans. Vance has transformed in just a couple of years from being a self-proclaimed, quote, never Trumper, end quote, who once called Trump, quote, America's Hitler, end quote, to the Heritage Foundation's and Project 2025's most vocal advocate. I now understand why Trump tries to distance himself from both the Foundation and their project. It is a hornet's nest of batshit crazy hatefulness, and if Trump has any hope of winning a second term, he desperately needs the support of moderate Republicans who feel Project 2025 is a bridge too far. However, it's difficult for Trump to distance himself from the foundation that wrote Project 2025, given he delivered the Heritage Foundation's keynote address as the sitting president of the United States at their President's Club meeting on October 17, 2017. Yet Trump has subsequently said he doesn't know anything about it. It's also difficult for Trump to distance himself from the foundation and their project as he simultaneously announced J.D. Vance as his running mate, given Vance has deep ties to the Heritage Foundation and to its president, Kevin Roberts. Roberts, the architect of Project 2025, has been the president of the foundation since 2021. Vance has praised Roberts for helping to turn the foundation into, quote, the de facto institutional home of Trumpism, end quote. Vance routinely pulls themes from Project 2025 as he campaigns. Vance also authored the foreword to Roberts' upcoming book, Dawn's Early Light. Roberts' book, when originally announced, had the subtitle, quote, Burning Down Washington to Save America, end quote, and featured a match on the center of its cover art. After the political blowback this summer of well-founded concerns regarding the Heritage Foundation and their project, the release of the book was pushed from September to after the election, fearing it may harm Trump's campaign. They also changed the subtitle to Taking Back Washington to Save America. The match was removed from the cover art. In the original marketing language that framed conservatives as being on the, quote, warpath to, quote, burn down institutions, end quote, like the FBI, the Department of Justice, and universities, was toned down and removed altogether. Vance wrote the foreword for Roberts' book, which contained a couple of shocking standouts, but the most disturbing for me was, quote, it's time to circle the wagons and load the muskets, end quote. More MAGA Republican calls to violence, more calls to the violent opposition of the peaceful transfer of power, more MAGA settler fantasy porn. Do these muskets and wagons also come with cholera, mountain fever, and scurvy? What is it with MAGA Republicans and their infatuation with creating what seems to be akin to little fascists on the prairie? Did any of them ever read Laura Ingalls Wilder? Although Trump and his campaign continue their gaslit denials regarding any involvement or understanding of the foundation and their project, Trump, Vance, and Roberts have already shown their true colors and close ties. The public's reaction to said ties just put them on something of a leash, for now. Perhaps you've wondered why the Trump campaign began pushing for the destruction of the Federal Department of Education. To me, it's because the fastest way to destroy any common set of beliefs as Americans is to destroy our public schools. Benjamin Franklin knew it. He believed all children, regardless of race, class, or gender, should have access to a good education and that well-educated citizens could govern themselves. The Heritage Foundation knows this too, and it's why they want to subvert it, bend it to their will, or flat-out destroy it. Anytime Donald Trump says he wants to eliminate the Federal Department of Education at a rally and return control of education to the states, his base cheers. Anytime you hear a MAGA Republican popping off about returning something to state control, whether it's federal parks, abortion, women's reproductive care, gender-affirming care, or LGBTQ rights, you can guarantee it's because they don't want a cohesive set of federal standards or guardrails, and that they have plans at the state level to burn it down and reinvent it in the image they want to see without any federal interference. They want federal institutions and policies weakened or destroyed, and most certainly under MAGA Republican control. The GOP has also made a hornet's nest out of critical race theory being taught in schools. I bet most people don't even know what that is, or that it is rarely, if ever, taught outside of college, and rarely taught there either. CRT is a fabricated issue, like so many of their fabricated issues, designed to motivate their base and sow division between Americans. Watching GOP talking points unfold since 2015 has been for me like watching a Machiavellian version of The Music Man. Every time they come up with an issue, from CRT to immigrants eating their neighbors' pets, to doctors performing post-birth abortions, to wokeism, to transgendered care, it's just the GOP's version of the song Trouble. And the trouble in question, the trouble they are creating, is far worse than a pool table having come to a small Iowa town. The nonsense about CRT is yet another dog whistle argument and polarizing lightning rod rooted in the fears of, mostly white, people about children learning about things like slavery and racial inequality. Keeping the history of racial inequality and slavery away from young people is to keep them ignorant of their past, of America's past, so a bunch of Christian conservatives can rewrite our country's past to their advantage. Couple this with the infamously conservative billionaire Koch brothers' efforts to corporatize and privatize public education, and the attack on public schools from the right becomes clear. Privatize schools, disband the Federal Department of Education, let the states decide what facts to teach, control the curriculum and the classroom materials used, don't talk about the history of race, don't talk about transgendered people, don't talk about anything LGBTQ, and don't teach sex education. Without a common curriculum taught throughout the nation, without a nationally shared set of history, facts, and culture, in as little as 12 years, Americans would have no common ground, no common set of experiences, and no unifying set of shared values. We'd be left with sets of regional, geopolitical beliefs, cultures, and facts, all of which would be bad for our children, bad for business, and bad for America. People are entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts. This approach to state-led education and the privatization of K-12 schools is discussed both in Project 2025 and in a report published in 2021 called The Koch Network and the Capture of K-12 Education. Indoctrinating a nation's youth to believe a warped set of views is not new. Hitler was quite successful with his Nazi youth program, something I'm sure wouldn't be taught if the tenets of Project 2025 get implemented. Teach children and young people what to think, control what they learn about America's history and their place in it within the context of slavery and racism. Stop teaching critical thinking skills, and you can raise an ignorant and more easily controlled generation. I've spent the last couple of months educating myself more on the key messaging that seems to have traction with MAGA Republicans in order to understand what has them so unnerved, to understand how we got to erroneous fever-pitch rhetoric of immigrants and immigration, how we got to Trump saying he'd deport the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, back to Venezuela, his word, not mine, and J.D. Vance saying he'd deport them all back to Haitian, his word, not mine. Haitians come from Haiti, and a former president and his running mate, a senator from Ohio, should know that. In my efforts to educate myself, I discovered a podcast called The Ezra Klein Show. He's a journalist and podcaster for the New York Times. A few weeks ago, I listened to his long view episode on the issues with America's immigration policies, and more recently to an episode called MAGA is Not as United as You Think. For the latter, his guest speaker was Emily Jashinsky, a former editor for The Federalist, one of the most influential websites among conservatives today. She is also part of what is being called the New Right. During the MAGA episode, as they discussed Project 2025, Jashinsky made the following comment, quote, "And that's why Project 2025 and Heritage also have something called the 100-day agenda that hasn't been made public yet. It's internal. I've never seen it. But it's the executive orders that should be ready to go on day one," end quote. referring to day one of the Trump presidency. Hearing that, I thought, if a party that literally and regularly fabricates events to support crises that aren't even happening, what must these executive orders hope to accomplish that are so extreme, even they know they must keep them hidden from the public? It's cause for concern. That particular episode made me start doing keyword searches in my PDF of Project 2025. I searched for LGBTQ. Project 2025 wastes no time coming after the LGBTQ community. On page 4, they state their desire to erase us entirely. They write, quote, "The next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists." End quote. Sit with that for a minute. Rewind that bit if you'd like. That is some hardcore George Orwell 1984 shit right there, as they are literally taking away people's First Amendment rights. By removing specific language from all existing legislation, they state they are doing so to protect people's First Amendment rights. Orwell wrote, quote, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and 2 + 2 = 5. End quote. He also wrote, there, quote, "will be no loyalty except loyalty towards the party." End quote. And who does that sound like? On the next page, they write, this is a doozy, quote, "The noxious tenets of critical race theory and gender ideology should be excised from curricula in every public school in the country. These theories poison our children, who are being taught on the one hand to affirm that the color of their skin fundamentally determines their identity and even their moral status, while on the other, they are taught to deny the very creatureliness that inheres in being human and consists in accepting the givenness of our nature as men or women." End quote. First, what wackadoo wrote that? Creatureliness? Inheres? Givenness? Second, someone will have to explain to me how they argue that CRT teaches children that the color of their skin determines their identity, which they imply is a bad thing, while Trump simultaneously talks about how immigrants are taking away, quote, "black jobs." And again, no one is teaching critical race theory in public K-12 schools. It is a fabricated issue. The project goes on to state that the next conservative administration, quote, "reverse the Biden administration's focus on LGBTQ+ equity and replace such policies with those encouraging marriage, work, motherhood, fatherhood, and nuclear families." End quote. In other words, to specifically advance heterosexual marriages and families with their own biologically conceived children, not adoptive families. This also suggests that they may well come after the legality of divorce itself. Their position to encourage marriage and nuclear families doesn't just denigrate LGBTQ people. That is exactly the thinking that gets MAGA Republicans like Sarah Huckabee Sanders to the notion that children who aren't someone's biological children are somehow less that person's child, and that those families are somehow less a family, if a family at all. To suggest that an adoptive parent is any less a parent, that a relationship between an adoptive parent and their adopted child is somehow less, that your family is somehow less than someone else's family, someone who gave birth to their child, that to not have your own biological children makes you somehow less invested in America's future, is repugnant and ridiculous. By that logic, anyone without children can stop paying school taxes, because if we're not emotionally invested in America's future, as evidenced by our lack of children, why should we pay for the education of someone else's kids? Of course, the answer to that question is because we are invested in the future of America, and the future of America is best secured by educating the next generation. I tried transgender and got only 13 results. They also came with disturbing goals and language. They go on to call for the next conservative president to, quote, "rescind regulations prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, and sex characteristics." End quote. Boy, the gloves came off on that one. We don't hear the phrase sex characteristics often, and it includes intersex individuals who, according to the Mayo Clinic, are persons who have genitals, chromosomes, or reproductive organs that don't fit into a binary male or female sex. The genitals of an intersex person might not match their reproductive organs, or they may have traits of both sexes. Being intersex may be evident at birth, in childhood, in adulthood, or never at all. And although we don't typically hear much about intersex individuals, there are roughly as many intersex people as there are redheads, and that's a lot of people. The project doesn't leave out those suckers and losers Trump is always going on about, or as I like to call them, the people who served our country, sometimes giving their health, limbs, or lives for our protection and the protection of American democracy. Regarding the Veterans Health Administration, and specifically around women and transgendered service people, it says to, quote, "rescind all departmental clinical policy directives that are contrary to principles of conservative governance, starting with abortion services and gender reassignment surgery." End quote. Project 2025 continues to come after the LGBTQ community and HIV-positive persons through the recommended changes to the Department of Defense, stating they need to, quote, "restore standards of lethality and excellence. Entrance criteria for military service and specific occupational career fields should be based on the needs of those positions. Exceptions for individuals who are already predisposed to require medical treatment, for example, HIV positive or suffering from gender dysphoria, should be removed, and those with gender dysphoria should be expelled from military service." End quote. It goes on to state, quote, "Gender dysphoria is incompatible with the demands of military service, and the use of public monies for transgender surgeries or to facilitate abortion for service members should be ended." End quote. There's a lot to unpack in their recommendations for the VA and the DoD. First, when Trump banned transgendered people from serving in the military via a tweet during his first term, the armed forces stated that doing so would compromise the military through loss of critical talent. Second, the estimated cost of implementing Trump's ban back in 2017 was estimated at more than $600 million. Third, the majority of Americans support having transgendered persons serving in the military. Fourth, research shows that transgendered persons are statistically more likely than cisgendered people to serve in the armed forces at all. Fifth, HIV has not been predominantly a gay male disease for a generation. In a study from 2022, 1.2 million Americans were living with HIV at the time, and 50% of all new HIV diagnoses were Black, cisgendered women. Sixth, gender dysphoria is a politically charged, dated, and misleading phrase used to denigrate someone who feels their sexual identity doesn't align with their birth sex. The scientifically accurate term used by the American Psychological Association is gender incongruence, defined as a marked and persistent difference between a person's gender identity and their assigned sex at birth. The difference between saying gender dysphoria and gender incongruence is the difference between saying someone is just confused rather than misaligned from who they know themselves to be on the inside versus what they look like on the outside. It's a way of denying their reality, and it's an ugly slur. Seventh, given the military has paid for an infinitesimal number of sex reassignment surgeries, this is just another conservative Christian false flag rooted in ignorance, intolerance, and fear. There's no hate quite like Christian love. And finally, eighth, did you catch how they hit abortion in both those sections? I searched on diversity and got 53 hits. The language around those results showed the project's broader anti-LGBTQ, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. As I continued to read Project 2025, it became clear that the Heritage Foundation has a real hard-on for eliminating the principles of DEI. They do not like woke people, or laws enacted for the fair treatment of people they don't think of as, well, people. The first agency Project 2025 goes after out of their hatred for DEI is the United States Agency for International Development. Never heard of it? Me neither. But the project specifically calls for it to be dismantled, along with its entire DEI apparatus. First, they start by eliminating the Chief Diversity Officer, then their DEI advisors, then by eliminating its DEI committees, then by canceling its DEI scorecard and dashboard, then by removing its DEI requirements, then by issuing directives to remove DEI requirements from contract applications and awards, then by issuing a directive to cease promotion of the DEI agenda, and it goes on and on for several pages. The ferociousness with which they attack this agency, relevant to its diversity practices, made me research what the agency is and what it's tasked to do. Founded in 1961 by then-President John F. Kennedy, the United States Agency for International Development's mission is to work around the world to accomplish the following goals: build and support democratic governance, ensure participation and inclusion, and that everyone being governed has a voice in their governance, enable periodic, credible, free, fair, and peaceful elections and transitions of power, boost independent media and journalism, and defend it against digital surveillance, censorship, and repression, while infusing democratic values and human rights principles into the adoption of major new technologies, advance civic engagement by helping develop and sustain effective institutions and citizen-responsive governance, promote justice and the rule of law while holding institutions and people accountable to the rule of law and providing access to justice mechanisms, advance respect for human rights by supporting efforts to prevent human rights abuses, protect human rights defenders, and respond to human rights abuses, counter resurgent authoritarian influence by strengthening democratic and institutional resilience to tackle authoritarian influence, disinformation, and digital authoritarianism, counter authoritarianism and strengthen democratic resilience, address and fight corruption, and promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility by ensuring all are included and represented in the governance process, including specifically protecting the most vulnerable, focusing on barriers to women's participation in government, and preventing and responding to gender-based violence. Something about those goals felt familiar, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I got the notion to invert them, and when I did so, I got this: destroy democracy, ensure only some people are able to participate and have a voice in their governance, disable fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power, weaken independent media and journalism, ignore democratic values and human rights, regress civic engagement by weakening or removing effective institutions and citizen-responsive governance, promote vindictiveness and weaken the rule of law to prevent institutions and people from being held accountable and weaken access to justice, destroy respect for human rights and allow human rights abuses, cozy up to resurgent authoritarian influence, weaken democratic practices to address disinformation and authoritarianism, deny and allow corruption, and destroy diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, exclude the most vulnerable, increase barriers to women participating in government, and allow and ignore gender-based violence. Flipping the goals of the USAID revealed to me what felt so familiar. The inverted version has been Donald Trump's talking points ever since he descended his golden escalator. Combining the flipped goals with Trump's own words, with his own behavior, and with the tenets from Project 2025 reveals a clear approach and pattern. Remove from government the voices of the LGBTQ community, of women, of families without biological children, of legal immigrants. Disable fair elections, something the GOP has been doing for years through gerrymandering. If the goal is to disable fair elections, you have the context for Trump's call to evangelicals to, quote, just vote for me one more time and you'll never have to vote again, end quote. You have the January 6th insurrection. You have the reason behind Trump's legal team recently filing 90 preemptive lawsuits across the country to challenge the election results. You understand why Trump tried to get Nebraska to restructure its electoral college votes to favor his changes. You have context for why Georgia's Board of Elections overstepped regarding rules for counting ballots to stall their tabulation and to introduce fear, uncertainty, and doubt as to their validity. You understand why Trump is suddenly flipping his own words about Americans never needing to vote again and trying to pin them absurdly on the Democratic Party. When you promote vindictiveness and weaken the rule of law, you lay bare the entire reason Donald Trump is running for a second term: to avoid accountability, prison, and to take vengeance on his political rivals, as he has already said he would do. When you no longer advocate for human rights and cozy up to authoritarians, you understand Trump's love for Putin, which he is perversely proud of. I just learned that while president, Trump had a shipment of COVID-19 test machines secretly sent to Russia for Putin's personal use in 2020, while Americans desperately needed them here. As far as I'm concerned, that's treason, pure and simple. It was also recently reported that Trump is said to have maintained contact with Putin since leaving office. Per an article in the New York Times, quote, "It would be highly unusual for a former president to privately talk with a top American adversary like Mr. Putin without clearing it through the current administration, especially at a time when the United States and Russia are on opposite sides of a war in Europe. Mr. Biden has not spoken with Mr. Putin since the invasion of Ukraine," end quote. If the Biden administration isn't speaking with Russia, I have to imagine Trump would not have received clearance to do so. This is Donald Trump, a traitor to America, a traitor to American values, and a traitor to Americans. As with all sociopaths, he cares only about himself. Those are a small handful of the goals of Project 2025, as outlined by the Heritage Foundation, embraced by Vance, and poorly denied by Trump. Understand, if Trump wins a second term and institutes Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation's as yet unseen series of executive orders for his first 100 days in office, it won't just be my rights as a gay man and my marriage that will be at risk. You can guarantee women's rights, not just to reproductive care, but in general, will also be greatly diminished. The very legality of interracial marriage will be at risk. The ACLU reminded us in 2022, on the 50th anniversary of the landmark case Loving v. Virginia, which made interracial marriage legal across the United States, that the legal reasoning used by Supreme Court Justice Alito to overturn Roe v. Wade could also be used to overturn Loving v. Virginia. The ACLU wrote, quote, "To those who say Loving v. Virginia will never be overturned, be cautious and vigilant. The United States has a long history of criminalizing, surveilling, and controlling Black and brown families and the mixing of races. We must both celebrate and honor our right to marry whomever we want and work to ensure its protection in the future." End quote. We are at that moment. Immigrants and immigration will be met with the full force of Trump's hateful rhetoric. Let's remember what a disaster Trump's policy on illegal immigration was during his first term. How his attempt to deter migrants from crossing into the U.S. by ripping their families apart had little impact on illegal immigration. To paraphrase a BBC article by Madeleine Halpert from May of this year, Trump's policy allowed the Justice Department to prosecute and deport adults who crossed the border illegally, while separating their children from them and placing them in government custody. These children spent days in detention centers, and some were crowded into metal cages without access to showers and adequate food. To me, then and now, his policy sounded a lot like a Nazi concentration camp. Halpert went on to write, quote, "Hundreds of children had to wait years, some more than half of their lives, in the U.S., in foster care settings and with relatives and friends before seeing their immediate families again." On the 5-year anniversary of the day Trump's policy was announced, the U.S. government said nearly 1,000 children are still waiting to be reunited with their families. That is an epic failure of America's core values, an epic failure of immigration policy, and a complete breach of basic human rights. Trump has said our borders will be closed should he become president. He has said of rounding up illegal immigrants that it would be, quote, "a bloody story," end quote. He fabricated a since disproven claim that a Venezuelan street gang had taken over a suburban apartment complex in Denver, saying at one of his rallies, quote, "And you know, getting them out will be a bloody story. They should never have been allowed to come into our country. Nobody checked them," end quote. Nobody checked them because the entire situation was a lie. Just another lie. Trump has also talked about shooting illegal immigrants in their legs. These are things I would imagine happening in those shithole countries Trump used to talk about. And I have to ask, is Trump trying to make America great again? Or turn America into a shithole country with no moral compass and abysmal human rights policies? Trump is the Lord of lies, hysteria, division, a twice-impeached former president, an adjudicated rapist, and has 34 felony convictions. How the hell did we get here? Trump's rhetoric is clear. Project 2025 is clear. The legal changes from the SCOTUS that have opened a path for a president to be considered above the law are clear. America could all too quickly become a white supremacist Christian nation and no place to live if you happen to be other than white, male, cisgendered, and Christian. I said earlier that Project 2025 wants to weaken any federal-level rules and oversight and push it to the states so MAGA Republicans can do whatever they want, whenever they want. And we've already seen many examples of states workshopping some of this. The Don't Say Gay state of Florida has made it legal for doctors to deny care based on their moral beliefs, a flagrant violation to the ethics of their sworn Hippocratic oath. The use of preferred pronouns is banned in public schools. Children have been barred from attending drag shows. Other states are going so far as to remove anything affirming about LGBTQ people from public schools, outing LGBTQ children to their families, something I've witnessed firsthand when I was in 8th grade and can attest to how dangerous and cruel it is. Said student went on to commit suicide later in life. Some states have legalized or are trying to legalize conversion therapy, a psychologically unfounded and damaging process rooted in the false belief that one's sexual orientation is a choice. One's sexual orientation is genetic. The gene was identified in the 1980s and the science is long since settled. Some states have made it illegal for a trans child to engage in team sports. This calendar year alone, the ACLU is tracking over 500 active pieces of state legislation to restrict or outlaw LGBTQ rights in 41 states. And that doesn't even cover laws already successfully enacted. Some states have instituted restrictions on women's health care. Laws in Texas, reestablished after the reversal of Roe v. Wade and just recently upheld by the SCOTUS, have caused a 56% increase in maternal fatalities, while the national average is 11%. The same Texas laws have also increased the number of newborn deaths by forcing women to carry fetuses to term that are known, in utero, to have absolutely no chance of surviving outside the womb. The GOP and MAGA Republicans are waging a war on civil liberties and civil rights while wrapped in the American flag, waving their Trump Bibles, and dog-whistling for violence. It is not hyperbole when Trump says he will be a dictator, and he certainly wouldn't be one for just a day. The man has no willpower and no ability to regulate his temper or his ego. We've already seen his desire for ultimate power through his actions and inactions leading up to and on January 6th, 2020. His appointments to the Supreme Court have already begun paving the way for his success. And should he be reelected, he may be able to appoint 2 additional justices in his second, and perhaps never-ending, term. Trump and his loyalists will destroy American democracy as we know it. It is not hypothetical. It is not rhetoric. It is why so many generals and generational Republicans are coming out against a second Trump presidency. And still the race is somehow statistically tied. Trump's re-election campaign has done nothing in the way of producing any evidence of any policy, and in that vacuum, it is expected he will turn to Project 2025 as his playbook because he has no interest in policy. Trump wants power. Trump wants to avoid going to jail for his crimes. Trump wants to be a king and to have parades while others, like Vance, act as his prime minister and go about the details of dismantling American democracy. The insincerity of the messaging coming out of the Trump-Vance campaign is so blatant as to be surreal. They claim to focus on wholesome issues such as virtue and family, American ideals, and Christian values. It's all so much theater. I am absolutely convinced that if Donald Trump secures the presidency a second time, the rights of the LGBTQ community, women, people of color, adoptive families, and legal immigrants will be grossly diminished or reversed. The LGBTQ community has fought and died to secure our access to the same civil liberties and civil rights enjoyed by all other Americans. My traditional nuclear American family threw me out of my own home and wished me dead from AIDS when I stood up for who I was at 21. My relationship with my family never recovered after I came out. The older I got, the harder it was for me to rationalize their professed love and support for me as a gay man, while each year they'd vote in opposition to my rights as a human being. There's no reconciling a disconnect that fundamental. You don't get to say you love me, then vote against my rights. I've weeded out friends for that same argument. Friends who were happy to come to parties in my home, eat my food, drink my liquor, tell me they loved me, and then vote against my basic rights. I'm done with that. Just as I've long been done with supporting businesses that target my rights as well. I know exactly where Chick-fil-A can stick that pickle. I've been physically threatened and stood up to those threats, fighting back when a group of young men tried to jump me outside a gay bar in my 20s, around the same time entitled homophobes were tossing pipe bombs into gay clubs across the country. I protested and marched and advocated not only for my rights and the rights of the broader LGBTQ community, but also for a woman's right to choose. I volunteered at Planned Parenthood in college, both in their male STD clinic and as an escort helping women of all ages safely cross protest lines so they could get the reproductive care they needed and were legally entitled to. And just this week, Vance vowed to cut all federal funding for Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is an organization whose primary goal is to help women and families prevent unwanted pregnancies. Prevent, not abort. Abortion is 3% of their budget. If Vance and Trump and MAGA Republicans want stronger, biologically derived nuclear families, they should be supporting Planned Parenthood, not endlessly trying to tear it down. I have been fired from 2 jobs for refusing to hide the fact that I was a gay man and for being unafraid and unashamed of being how I was born and who I had become as a young man and then a seasoned professional. I was the first openly gay elected official in my county and endured constant homophobic remarks and ridicule from my colleagues, community, and certain members of the press. I am old enough to have lived in an America when, as a gay man, I didn't have the same civil liberties and rights as others. There were no legal protections for me. I remember when it was illegal for gay people to marry. I remember when it was illegal for gay people to adopt. And I'm telling you, Trump and his MAGA loyalists want to take all of that away. That and so much more. My husband and I and the whole LGBTQ+ community are facing erasure. Literally erasure. First from the laws of the land, and then, I have to believe, from the country itself. These behaviors by MAGA Republicans, amplified by Trump and Vance, are exactly how Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power. Please don't let history repeat itself. My plea to you is twofold. First, this election goes beyond party. It is not exaggeration to say the core values and purpose of what it is to be an American are on the ballot and will be expressed by which presidential candidate you choose. Please, protect this all-too-fragile experiment known as American democracy. We can bicker about our differences in ideology later, but if we install a treasonous dictator in the White House, we will have no voice. I hope American democracy wins this November, and that the courts will then take care of Donald Trump once and for all. Perhaps then, the Republican Party can come back to itself or rise from their ashes. Second, never before has allyship been so crucial to the civil liberties of so many. This National Coming Out Day, to me, is not about coming out of your closet. It needs to be about coming out to vote. It needs to be about coming out to save the future of all Americans who have lived too long unprotected in the margins. We must have each other's backs, now more than ever. My husband and I are students of history. We saw the signs and took action starting in April to prepare for the worst, to prepare for the potentiality of a second Trump presidency. And we found out while I was writing this episode that our application for a foreign residency visa had been granted. We don't want to flee our home and our country and leave behind the life and friends it took us 56 years to find. And we hope we don't need to. But you hope for the best and you plan for the worst. Thank you for listening. And vote. Vote like your rights and the rights and lives of the people you love depend on it. Because they do.